We're here with Bradley Tusk, the CEO of Tusk Ventures and the author of a new book called The Fixer. So, Bradley, brief overview of Tusk Ventures.
So we invest in and work with startups in regulated industries.
Yep.
So started doing that with Uber back in 2011, kind of fought all the political fights to make ride sharing legal, and now have done that with 15 different startups. So ranging from Bird, which is a scooter company,
Yep.
To Coinbase, Circle, Lemonade, FanDuel, a whole bunch of others.
So the idea is, whereas a VC might add value in terms of their expertise around growing small companies, you bring not only capital, but domain expertise around how to overcome regulatory hurdles such that a company can scale in an unfettered way.
That's the idea.
Got it.
Yeah.
So your book, give us a sense, give us the top line on your book.
So the book is called The Fixer,
Yep.
My Adventure Saving Startups from Death by Politics. And effectively, it's a memoir, but it's meant to help startups think about how should you deal with politics, how should you deal with regulation. I think for a long time, there was this kind of libertarian vibe in the Valley where it's like, government shouldn't get in my way, I'll do what I want to do. And even if they're right, that's not how the world actually works,
Yep.
right? And I think after watching Uber and Airbnb and FanDuel and all these companies have these really big regulatory battles, founders have started to realize, okay, I've got to take this stuff seriously. But then the question is, what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
How do you think about politics? And so what the book tries to do is through stories of our work with Lemonade or Tesla or FanDuel or Handy or Ease or Uber and others, teach different lessons of kind of what worked, what didn't work, and how to think about each specific situation.
So let's talk specifically about Uber. Give us, I know that was a big fight, and ultimately de Blasio had to back down, and you were involved in that.
Yep.
Tell us, give us briefly kind of the situation and what you were able to do to rally.
Yeah, so
for
this
Uber.
was a couple of years ago in the summer of 2015,
Yep.
and Mayor Bill de Blasio is the mayor of New York
Yep.
City. The taxi industry are his biggest campaign donors,
Yep.
and they wanted him to put legislation through that would really kind of shut down Uber and make it hard for them to operate in New York. And de Blasio and his ally, the head of the city council, put this bill in together. They announced they were going to pass it in a month.
And what was the bill? Because when you say shut down Uber, I
bill
don't
was-
remember it being shutting down
It was
Uber.
effectively capping its growth, saying the amount of drivers you have right now is what you can
Yeah.
always have. And then
Yeah.
since drivers always a trip from the platform,
Yeah.
it's eventually a death sentence. Never in the history of the city council had the mayor and city council speaker both been for a bill and it not actually passed. And the New York City Council, like 49-2 is considered a close vote, right? And I get a call from Travis one day, Travis Kalanick, who then was the CEO of Uber, sitting in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, trying to get on a flight standby. It's raining, everything that could go wrong is going wrong. And he says, hey, we got to beat this thing back. I'm like, you can't, right? If they want to pass it, they're going to pass it. And he said, well, can you try to figure it out? And I said, two questions. How much can I spend? Is there anything I can't do? And he said, do whatever you have to do. And on the flight back, it kind of hit me that no one had ever challenged de Blasio from his left. Everything was always like big bad corporation versus his progressive mayor. So what if we ran a campaign that said that he's being racist, anti-immigrant, anti-worker, the kind of things he's not used to getting hit with, and we just went out that full bore. We ran like $5 million worth of TV ads in a month. We rallied our customers. We rallied our drivers. We put a thing on the Uber app that said de Blasio is one of the choices. So like say Uber X, Uber Black. De Blasio, 25-minute wait time. Click here to tweet at your city council member.
Yep.
And we kept picking up votes. 2 votes here, 3 votes there. And then all of a sudden, a couple of days before they were supposed to call the bill, we got asked to come to a meeting. And we figured they'd want to negotiate. We came up with a whole list of concessions that we could make in the meeting. And the meeting's over, and all they wanted was to take down the TV ads and make the fight go away.
Oh, really?
And so it turns out you can't fight City Hall.
But it felt as if it was, if I remember correctly, just as someone who uses Uber a lot, it felt very consumer-led. It felt like you tried to activate or weaponize the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what a lot of the campaigns that we do on the tech side are. Because if you think about it, in most cases, you have a startup that, at least in the early days, is not particularly well funded, and they're disrupting an entrenched interest who usually is giving a lot of money to politicians, right? And so it's hard to compete on the basis of campaign donations, lobbyists, all the traditional metrics that you hear about, like in Washington, for example, don't really work for startups. So the question is, what do we have that can get back and counter all of this? And because most politicians at the end of the day are thinking solely about re-election, and either if we can do something that imperils their chance of re-election, they'll listen to us, or if we do something that enhances their chance of re-election, they'll listen to us, and otherwise they'll ignore us. Our customers are actually our best weapon and best base. So for Uber, we've been mobilizing customers now for years all over the country. The book has a chapter about how we first started doing this in DC. The city council was going to literally at that point put Uber out of business, so you can't conduct a taxi business with an iPhone. I think in the span of a week, we had 100,000 unique emails sent to the city council. Bill lost, we won. FanDuel, people who love fantasy sports really love fantasy sports. They've probably never voted in a primary in their life, but they're willing to advocate for it. Bird's a scooter company right now that's growing very quickly. We just passed a bill in Miami last week and activated our riders and customers to really lobby the city commissioners to do that. And so you can't do that for every startup. It needs to be a startup where the users are pretty passionate about it and they feel like, hey, if I don't advocate, this thing can go away. If this thing goes away, my quality of life goes down because I like scooters, ride sharing, fantasy sports, whatever it is. So not every startup can utilize it. Like for example, Airbnb can't use it, not because people don't like it, but because all of their guests are by definition not voters in wherever they're visiting, right?
Yeah.
So all the scale is on the guest side.
That's right.
So some guy from Sweden has a nice stay at an Airbnb in Brooklyn, and maybe he emails the local state senator to say leave Airbnb alone, but what does the state senator care? This guy's in Sweden, he can't
Yeah,
vote
but
for you.
don't you have the renters are voters?
They are, but here's the problem. Anytime there's a regulatory fight that's specific to Airbnb,
Yeah.
it means that what they're doing may or may not be legal,
So
so
they're
they're
not-
usually
they're
not
out
raising
there.
their hand too much. Yeah,
Got
they're
it.
pretty
And
reticent.
isn't there some sort of new legislation or action against Uber?
Yeah, so a couple of, about a month ago, de Blasio and the taxi industry revisited the same fight we beat
Yeah.
back in 2015. Uber, about a year and change ago, got a new CEO,
Yep.
and he is very smooth, very smart, but his mandate was calm everything down, no conflict, no confrontation, don't fight. And that has worked really well in certain ways, but the problem is it's hard to be the guy that everyone likes and take on a bare-knuckled fight in the city council at the same time against a cartel like taxi. And de Blasio and taxi sort of saw their opening, and they struck, and this time
And what
they
is the
passed it.
legislation? What
It
happened?
caps the number of Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, so however many we have right now is what we'll have going forward.
And what, as someone who's heard about these taxi cab drivers who mortgaged their house to buy Medallion thinking it was going to be their retirement one day, went from 100,000 to $1 million, now they're down to, 300 or 350,000. What is the argument? And I know that you're not a policy guy, you're somebody who helps VCs get around this stuff. But what was the argument Uber was making against some sort of medallion or some sort of investment or friction similar to what the cabs? What's a philosophical argument for someone who just needs a phone to pick up riders versus cab drivers who have to spend $1 million on a medallion?
I mean, the first thing is cab drivers shouldn't have to spend $1 million on a
Right.
medallion, right? I mean, the city effectively created this monopoly system,
Yeah.
and it usually wasn't the poor cab driver who mortgaged his house. It was a guy that collected 60 medallions, and he was
Yep.
worth $300 million,
Yeah.
and he's leasing them out at exorbitant rates back to the immigrant drivers.
Right.
But fundamentally, most Ubers, especially outside of New York,
Yeah.
are small businesses where people have other jobs or other things in their life, and they spend 5 hours a week, 15 hours a week, picking people up and dropping people
Yeah.
off. They're independent contractors. They're working solely based on when they feel like working.
Yeah.
And that's a totally different business model than someone being a full-time taxi driver. So, the world of New York City regulation, that's true in most places, never envisioned a sharing economy, never envisioned platforms like Uber, never envisioned iPhones.
Yeah.
And as a result, taxis in most cities really declined in quality over a period of decades.
Oh,
where
yeah,
the
terrible.
reason why there was such a market for Uber
Yeah.
is because people hated the status quo, and that's true in every single city in America.
And someone like Airbnb, where you get these huge taxes, you check out of a hotel, and there's all these taxes, which has to be an incredible source of revenue for the city. And then Airbnb, quite frankly, doesn't pay taxes or doesn't charge the user a tax. Is that? I mean, you can see why cities are trying to figure out how do we support local companies while at the same time not impairing hotels when they have this additional tax, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and Airbnb in different jurisdictions has said, look, we'll add the taxes on, we'll
Yeah.
pay the taxes, we want to be able to continue to operate. But it gets down, I think, to a more fundamental question, which is, if you own an apartment and
Yep.
you want someone else to be able to stay there and pay you for it, whose right is that, right? I would argue that it's your property right to do with what you want with your property, and you shouldn't have to sort of get permission first from the city and pay lots of different taxes and fees for the right to do that.
But shouldn't,
Yeah.
if I buy a building and I start renting it out and I call it a hotel, why is that right any different? You're saying no one should have to pay taxes.
No, there's nothing wrong with paying taxes. I'm
Yeah.
saying that there's no reason why any city should say, we're going to favor this handful of Hyatt and Marriott and Hilton over our own actual constituents and residents who want to monetize their home. Look, I'm not an investor in Airbnb. I've never worked with Airbnb. I don't particularly care what happens to Airbnb one way or another. But it seems really wrong that a city could say, we're going to pick a handful of these really big hotel companies, usually none of whom are headquartered in your actual city, right? And pick them over our own residents.
Right. Talk to me about the scooters, because it seemed like that was starting to become a backlash. And now it's that backlash seems to have gone away.
Yeah, I mean, look, we got involved in a company called Bird about a year ago. We invested in their Series A. It became the fastest company ever to become a unicorn. It went from a $50 million valuation to a $2 billion valuation.
50 to 2 billion. In how long?
About an 8-month span.
Were you in the 50 million round?
Thank God we were in the 50.
Good for you.
But getting into each market is its own fight, right? And there are markets where they're really happy and eager to have birds, and we've just rolled them out really quickly. There are places where we have to pass new laws. We're doing that right now. Chicago, New York, Philly, Miami, and there are other places where birds are locked out completely, like San Francisco. So it really varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
And then Lemonade, that sounds like an interesting one. I know you're involved. That's a disruptor in the insurance industry. I would imagine the insurance lobby is really powerful.
They are, but kind of like taxi, at least in the early days, you can take them by surprise, right? Because they move so slowly and they're so entrenched and they're so used to saying, okay, I'm friends with the deputy insurance commissioner in Michigan and therefore I can lean on him to repress any type of competition, which works until you start making the governor of Michigan look bad. And then all of a sudden the governor starts screaming at someone on his staff, who starts screaming at the insurance commissioner, what are you doing? And make this go away. And it goes away by letting companies like Lemonade compete and offer insurance. And so the kind of approach that most traditional incumbents take tends to be much more insider-based, not kind of the opposite of the consumer-based campaigns that you talked about a little earlier, and that's really where we've had this advantage. So Lemonade, we were able to overcome the insurance industry and the entrenched interest, get our license in New York, then did the same in California, we passed the bill in Florida, and they're all over the country. Now Lemonade operates in most states.
So let's talk about cannabis delivery. It feels like there's this green wave, if you will, but then you hear Jeff Sessions instructing people to continue to look at marijuana as a narcotic, just kind of, I was like, wow, it's back to the 60s all of a sudden. But what is, legislatively, and talk about the states, what's happening?
It's interesting. So you have this real dichotomy where in 30 states now, medical marijuana is legal. In 9 states, recreational marijuana is legal. But on the federal level, it's totally illegal. So cannabis right now is considered a Schedule I drug, which is what Sessions was talking about. And that's like heroin or cocaine. I mean, really serious drugs. And so states are just kind of moving forward. Federal government is saying no, and yet because it's pretty popular, you don't see ATF agents like storming a dispensary in Oregon or Colorado or California or wherever it is. So they're in this weird murky gray area where they can operate in the state, but they have trouble getting a bank account. They can't advertise. So they can do certain things, can't do others. I don't think that industry really becomes robust in a real tech industry until it's removed from Schedule I.
So that's interesting. You think that would argue that a lot of these marijuana stocks that are trading at outrageous valuations, until that Schedule I comes off, they might be overvalued.
There's some real risk potentially, and the other issue is there's public companies, but especially on the startup side, most VCs can invest in things that are kind of federally illegal, right? So let's say
because of their limiteds.
Yeah, because their pension fund investors, whoever else, say, we don't want you doing this. And the challenge that poses for cannabis tech is the way that most startups can grow really quickly is they're allowed to lose a lot of money, and so that they can scale really quickly. If you can't raise nearly as much money, you're stuck running a much more traditional kind of business, and it's much harder to scale. And so cannabis tech especially, now there are some winners. We're luckily an investor in a company called Ease, which is kind of Uber for weed, and that's done really well. But by and large, I think it's going to be a bumpy road until cannabis comes off of Schedule I.
And not that I care, but tell me the exact situation in Manhattan.
Right now, so right now in New York, medical marijuana is legal, but in a very, very limited way. In fact, so much so the program hasn't really worked at all. We just had a primary for governor in New York last week. Governor Cuomo was challenged by one named
He had to
Cynthia
pivot
Nixon.
to the left, right?
Right. So Nixon was all for marijuana legalization. So Cuomo also pivoted to the left. So now you have the governor on record saying he's for it. The state legislature is likely to be totally Democratic-led come next year. So I think there's a good chance that New York legalizes recreational marijuana. And then the question will become delivery, and the laws vary by jurisdiction. So in California, for ease, every California municipality has to okay it on their own terms. So we have to run campaigns in places like LA and San Jose to make it legal. If I were ease, as a state is moving towards statewide recreational legalization, you really want to address that in the statewide legislation.
Let's talk about big tech. What do you think the likelihood is, or non-likelihood, of them being broken up?
You know, look, I think it varies from company to company because the basis for an antitrust case isn't exactly the same across the board. But, you know, we're in an interesting wave where you have Trump is a populist in some ways, also has sort of very personal vendettas against different companies. If you ask me right now, it's a good chance the Democratic nominee in 2020 will also be a populist coming out of the left because there's so much energy and momentum on the more partisan sides of each party. So as a result, you could see both general election candidates in 2020, let's say it's Trump and Elizabeth Warren, both saying, yeah, let's break up Amazon, let's break up Google. So then the question becomes, is there a really legal basis to do so? Unclear. I mean, Europe has certainly taken certain steps around GDPR and antitrust violations, and they fined Google on $2 billion. Whether in U.S. law that's sufficient basis to require a company breaking up, a little unclear. It kind of depends on your definition of monopoly.
Or who is most likely and least likely to be broken up?
It's a good question. I think Amazon is probably the least likely because even though they're probably the most powerful, I have a little bit of a hard time seeing what the basis is for it, right? What they own is they own a percentage of pretty much every category, but they don't own all of any category, right? Twitter and Facebook are
50% of e-commerce.
Right. Yeah, as broad based, but then when you do it by sector, they're always smaller. Google certainly owns search in a way that is pretty predominant. So I think they're greatest at risk. I think people might like to break up Facebook simply because they're upset by it in different ways.
They're angry.
But the basis to do so isn't quite clear. I mean, what's really interesting is you have these startups like Google or Facebook or Twitter that emerged in a frictionless way because they weren't, unlike most of the stuff that we work on, disrupting entrenched interests who then fought back. For a lot of these much bigger companies, the way they got so big was they came up in a more frictionless environment. They weren't disrupting anyone initially, but all of a sudden they got so powerful and so big that now people are asking a lot of questions.
So give us a couple predictions. You're sort of an insider. Predictions about unicorns, prediction about politics. Tell us something that, go out on a limb here where we look back and go, wow, that guy really had his finger on the pulse.
Yeah, so one is I'll say, I think crypto is real and it's here to stay.
Crypto's real.
I believe so.
So it's what, at $6,500 today? Do you think it goes up from here?
You know, I'm not a trader. We don't participate in ICOs. We've invested in underlying exchanges like Circle and Coinbase and Ripple, but it's not so much that the value of any particular currency is going up and down. For all I know, Bitcoin will be gone in 3 weeks. But I do believe this. There's a massive loss of trust in this system. People don't trust government. They don't trust the media. They don't trust Wall Street. They don't trust the church. And that trust has to go somewhere in a vacuum. And that, by the way, it's both the U.S. but globally as well. And I think what cryptocurrency does is it provides, it helps fill the vacuum. So I don't think it's going anywhere. It'll take different formations. How to regulate it's really confusing. We're involved in a lot of the SEC work around that, but it's pretty complicated stuff to say the least. But I really think it's here to stay. One more thing in the transportation space, and obviously I've got a lot in this space, so I'm both knowledgeable and highly biased and
Highly
conflicted. But you're going to see government start to pass congestion pricing, I think, in cities all over the U.S. I think New York could happen as soon as the next 6 months. That will fundamentally change the way that people get around from point A to point B, which really paves the way for alternate modes of transportation, like electric scooters, like e-bikes, and much of the way that the rest of the world gets around in a combination of cars, bikes, walking, public transportation, rickshaws, lots of different ways, much less reliant on the car than the U.S. is. I think you'll start to see that here too.
So you're a fan of crypto, or you think that, I agree with you, it's sort of a proxy for our lack of trust in institutions, which I think is the right way to look at it. Density pricing, alternative forms of transportation going to boom. Anything else?
Yeah, sports betting. I think you're going to see a wave of, so, you know, again, we're investors in FanDuel, so I'm biased, but I believe that in the next 2 to 3 legislative sessions, 25 to 30 states will legalize sports betting. Not only will it happen for sports, but you'll start to see for esports as well, which will ultimately become, I think, potentially bigger than traditional sports betting. And what that will also probably mean is the traditional land-based casino is going to really decline because
So Vegas gets hurt even more.
You know, Vegas, so in a weird way, because Vegas at least is a destination, but
hot,
40 states have land-based casinos or riverboat casinos or something that's not Vegas.
Or even the lottery maybe
Right,
gets hurt.
lotteries too. So the question is, why, once you can do any kind of gaming you want, and you can play Fortnite and bet on it and never have to leave your couch, you're going to go do a scratch-off ticket, you're going to do a pick six, right? You're going to go pull slots at the local Indian casino. Why would you do that? So I think what you're going to see is new forms of gaming really skyrocket and be more pervasive than gaming is today, and a lot of traditional forms really suffer.
And do the leagues benefit from?
Yeah, ultimately they do. I mean, right now they're all wrangling to get a piece of the action in different ways with these nonsense integrity fees and things like that. But one of the ways that the NFL can combat decline in viewership and ratings is people have something else at stake at the game, right? It may be that their team's out of the game already, but much in the way that people got engaged in individual player performance because of fantasy sports, once they have real money legally on the line, and yeah, people have bookies, but we're talking about a totally different scale here. I think that really helps save sports like the NFL, maybe even baseball, which also has been in decline. So I think the leagues know it benefits them, but it's also better optics for them to complain about it.
God, baseball needs something. I could bet my kids' college savings, and I'm not sure I could get through the 7th inning of the game. Anyways, Bradley Tusk, CEO and founder of Tusk Ventures and author of the book The Fixer. Who's your publisher, Brad?
Penguin.
Penguin.
Yes.
Penguin Portfolio Rambling House?
Portfolio. Yeah, same
Penguin
as you.
Portfolio, same as me. What a thrill for them. Anyways, thanks for joining us today,
Thank you for having me.